Good morning, Title I coordinators. Thank you for joining us for the July webinar. My name is Erin Sudduth, and I'm the Title I Part 8 branch manager here. And I have a colleague with me today. I'll let him introduce himself.
I'm David Malonti, one of the assistant directors in this division.
Okay, so as I mentioned just a minute ago, as you're joining, please make sure that you're muting your microphone and turning off your camera just so that everybody can focus on the presentation. I've also got some of the KDE people kind of monitoring and they might mute you if you forget. So it might be a little more hectic today since we're in Teams instead of a lot of you on the live stream. So as always, we will have time at the end for questions. So at that point, if you want to use the raise hand feature and then unmute yourself or put it in the Teams chat, feel free to do that. You can also submit any questions or comments to me via email, and that's at erin.sudduth@education.ky.gov. And even though we're a little bit different today, just on Teams, we are still recording the webinar and it will be posted to the Documents and Resources webpage just like usual. A quick recap from our June webinar. We focused on what happens after monitoring. We mainly looked at what happens at the school and district level, but we also talked a little bit about some of the things that happen on the KDE side of things. We also looked at how you can take the monitoring results and apply those to your continuous improvement processes and efforts in the district. And finally, we looked at some of the more common district and school level findings from this past season of monitoring for the 22-23 school year. So if you weren't able to join us for that, be sure you go back and look at the recording. Districts who are selected for consolidated or desk monitoring for this coming school year will be notified in the fall. So watching that webinar might give you a better idea of what to expect, as well as reviewing our monitoring checklist. Or even those of you who aren't selected for monitoring, it might just help you with your documentation, organization, and things like that. So today's agenda, we've got some announcements and reminders. We'll touch on our July newsletter topics. I have some information about updated KDE resources for you. We have our reminder about the carryover limitation waiver for 22-23 funds. That's Project J. And then our main focus is going to be preparing for the upcoming school year. So we're going to talk about training staff, the Title I annual meeting, discussing that school family compact during conferences, and developing a plan to monitor your program effectiveness. So first, we have our announcements and reminders. I'm pretty sure everyone is aware at this point, but our fiscal year 2024 consolidated application is open in GMAP. That is due to KDE on August 11th. Remember, you can't submit until all the participating programs have done their part. And I also wanted to remind you that timely submission of items like the application, the comparability report, things of that nature, those are risk indicators for monitoring. So it's really important to try to adhere to those deadlines set by KDE. We also have renewed our subscription to Title I Admin for all districts. A while back, we had a survey that some of you completed for us, and the majority said they would like us to continue offering that resource. So we are going to still have that for the 23-24 school year. Those of you who get those emails, you may have noticed that they are starting to transition to a new name. They're going to be ESEA Now instead of Title I Admin, and there's going to be kind of some visual changes to the website and some improvements to functionality, but it's still the same resource. We do still have some districts who've not yet set up their access to this resource. So if you need to arrange that, there's a couple documents that you need to fill out. Please contact Ryan Bennett at LRP Media Group. That is the organization that provides the resource. You can also contact me with any questions. When you contact Ryan, he'll be able to give you those documents you need to complete, and he can also set up a training session and kind of walk you through the site, show you how it works, and how to make the most of this subscription. I will also say Be sure to check your junk folder to make sure that the ESEA Now emails aren't getting sent there. I think as they've been making the switch, I noticed the first one or two I got was in my junk folder. So go in there and mark those as not junk to make sure that you're receiving them. If you haven't had a chance to read our July newsletter, that is linked here on the slide. It's also posted on our Documents and Resources webpage. We leave all those newsletters and our webinars up for 1 year. And if you're not currently subscribed, I believe you can do so through the newsletter, or you can just reach out to me and I'll add you to the list. The topics that were in this month's newsletter, of course, we had an announcement about the GMAP application being open. Information on the updated equitable services guidance from the U.S. Department of Education. We had a reminder about spending down those fiscal year 2023 funds, the funds from this past school year. And we had some information about the Title I requirements and duties for paraprofessionals. Oh, I will also add that you probably received an email from me shortly after the newsletter was released. We did have a typo in there, so thank you to those of you who pointed that out for us. The version that's linked on the slide and the version that is posted on the website is the correct version. The typo has been fixed. Moving on to our updated resources, we do take a look at a lot of our resources on a regular basis just to make sure that the information is still up to date. All the citations are accurate. Sometimes those change. We make sure that all of the links work and things like that. So if you're ever looking at one of our documents and you think you see something that is a typo or maybe a link is broken, just reach out and we can go ahead and try to fix that. So we're just going to take a look at some of these recent changes. The first one is for the Title I Part A handbook. The changes here were pretty minimal. We added some citations to the Uniform Grant Guidance regarding paraprofessional requirements and a couple links to some of our newer documents, like that carryover information document that we looked at a few months ago. The updated handbook was posted in mid-June. Actually, most of these were posted in mid-June. I know some people like to print out a copy to have on hand. So just make sure that on the cover at the bottom, it says revised June 2023, and that's the most up-to-date version. The next resource is our monitoring checklist. Again, we had some very minimal changes here. Updates were made to all 4 of our checklists. We have a checklist for desk monitoring, a checklist for the consolidated monitoring at the district level, as well as the consolidated monitoring for school-wide programs and targeted assistance programs. So they all received some type of modification. That may have included some clarifying language added to some of our suggested or required documentation on a couple of the indicators. We did add one indicator to the homeless section that's on the district level consolidated checklist, and that has to do with evidence that appropriate staff have been trained on homeless procedures. I believe it's indicator number 8. And then in the fiscal management section, we added indicator number 10, which focuses on ensuring that 15% carryover limitation was met. So this is something that we've always looked for during monitoring, but this new indicator in the language really specifies the exact MUNIS report to run and the date range. We want you to run that report so that we can check for compliance there. And those were all also updated in mid-June. Next is the allowable cost checklist. We added a specification that the procedures should outline the steps taken in your district to ensure expenditures are allowable, as opposed to just restating those RAND, reasonable, allocable, necessary, and documented requirements. It needs to say how you're going to do it. We also added an additional guiding question regarding staff knowledge and capacity to use what's being purchased. That's added in the necessary section of that document. And that was posted in mid-June as well. And I know some of those things also came up in our June federal programs training with the Brewman Group. For our safeguarding assets document, we added a definition for the acquisition of cost straight out of Uniform Grant Guidance. And we also added a recommendation or best practice that non-consumable items that don't meet that $5,000 equipment capitalization threshold still be treated as equipment for the purpose of safeguarding. So thinking about some type of inventory, labeling, things like that. This was also posted in mid-June, and I think that the previous version was on our old KDE template. So if you open that, it probably looks a lot different than the old version, but the content changes were fairly minimal. And then the last one I have on here is our new coordinator training and PowerPoint, and I've got coming soon because it's not done yet. I know we've got some new coordinators who've joined us in recent weeks, and I've gotten some questions about training opportunities. So I haven't had a chance to record it yet, but that will be soon. What you're going to see there is some additional details and clarification points just being added throughout the training. Some of it you'll recognize from some of our more recent webinars. And I wanted to point out that although the intended audience for this training is our new coordinators, it can also be a great refresher of those Title I basics for those of you who have more experience. And don't forget that when it is posted, slide 3 of the PowerPoint lists the agenda and the training topics, and there's also corresponding timestamps, so you can just jump to a particular part of the video if you need to. So once that is complete, I'll go ahead and send out an email just to let you know that that's been updated. Okay, our carryover limitation. Section 1127A of ESSA does state that districts cannot carry over more than 15% of funds for an additional fiscal year. The Section B does allow the state to waive this limitation if we determine that your request to have it waived is reasonable and necessary, or there have been some supplemental appropriations that have become available. Now, this waiver can only be granted once in a 3-year period. I'll also point out that in Section C, it states that this requirement does not apply to districts that receive less than $50,000 in Title I Part A funds for the fiscal year, but that does not apply to most of us. So districts need to ensure that at least 85% of school year 22-23 funds, that's Project J, have been obligated for activities that occur no later than September 30th of 2023. And as a reminder, our April 2023 webinar had a deep dive into all things carryover. We looked at our new carryover information document, which is on our webpage. We also included a table outlining when a district is eligible to request another carryover waiver based on when they last requested one. If you're not sure if your district requested a waiver in recent years, just reach out and I'd be happy to let you know that. So for those of you who are going to need to request a carryover waiver, you will need to do that no later than September 30th, and that is done via email sent to David. And in that email, you've got to tell us a couple of things. First, just state that you are wanting to request a waiver to the 15% carryover limitation for 22-23 funds. You should also provide a reason that you have more than 15% carryover, and then describe a plan for effectively using those carryover funds. And again, there's links to that new document and the webinar that I mentioned a minute ago. All right, so moving on to the main part of today's webinar. If you joined us for the federal grants workshop with the Brewman Group last month, you'll probably remember that there was a pretty heavy focus on different policies and procedures that districts need to have in place. And our presenters also emphasized the importance of training staff on those policies and procedures. You may have written some really amazing procedures for your district, but if nobody knows about them or knows how to implement them, then they're basically kind of useless. So to help ensure that effective implementation, all staff who are responsible for implementation or involved in that process in some way should be trained. So first, kind of consider all of the policies, processes, procedures. I know I've said before, we use those pretty interchangeably. Think about all of those documents that your district has that are related to Title I Part A and which staff may need to be trained. which district level staff need training, maybe principals at Title I schools, teachers at Title I schools, or staff who are being paid partly or fully from Title I Part A funds. And don't forget that you need to be documenting those trainings. Could be agendas, meeting minutes, the actual training materials that you use, sign-in sheets, things like that. And we talk a lot about effective documentation, but as a reminder, you want to make sure that your documentation is essentially telling the story of what happened. So if all you save is a sign-in sheet, or a meeting agenda that's got one bullet that just says Title I procedures, that doesn't tell us what actually happened. So think of it as the person looking over your documentation, if you're selected for monitoring, a KDE staff member, when they look at that documentation, they should be able to gain a general understanding of what information was shared, with whom it was shared, and when it was shared. So let's think about some of the procedures that you may need to be reviewing with your staff. It's not necessary to review every single policy procedure with all staff. Just kind of think about who needs to be aware of a particular topic. So how are staff trained on the following? First, we've got our procedures for awarding credit, and that includes partial credit, as well as diplomas to homeless children. And during our May webinar, we reviewed a number of these requirements related to children and youth experiencing homelessness, and that includes these procedures. We had our state homeless education liaison, Zach Stumbo, on to share information. So who in your district needs to be familiar with these? Obviously, your homeless liaison is going to be very familiar with them, so maybe they're even the person who should be kind of leading some training. My first thought of other people who need to be aware would be guidance counselors, but there may be additional people in your district who work with credit accrual, diplomas, et cetera, things like that. And as I mentioned earlier with the monitoring checklist updates, one of the things we will be looking for this year is documentation that the appropriate staff have been trained on these procedures. Next up is allowability. So anyone who's involved with the expenditure of funds should be familiar with the district's allowability procedures. So kind of thinking beyond just the Title I coordinator and the finance officer, who else may be making requests to spend Title I funds? As I just mentioned, the homeless coordinator, they're involved in spending that homeless set aside. And in a lot of districts, the homeless coordinator works hand in hand with the family resource youth service center coordinators. Now, homeless set aside funds and the funds for family resource centers are different in terms of their allowability. So understanding that difference is going to be key in ensuring that all expenditures are allowable. Also, principals at Title I schools, they need to be familiar with allowability. Staff should be informed enough to consider those RAND requirements prior to sending a purchase request to the Title I coordinator. For districts serving private schools, is the concept of allowability being shared with private school principals? If the individuals who are submitting these purchase requests to the coordinator have a better understanding of allowability, that should really help you kind of streamline your request process. So instead of getting an email that just says, can we buy blank with Title I? People will know that they need to kind of give you a little bit of a justification and align that requested purchase with RAND. For districts reserving parent and family engagement funds, what about parents? We know that parents are able to provide input regarding how those PFE funds are spent. So would a basic overview of allowability enhance that feedback? Maybe the school should consider incorporating that information into the annual meeting. We're going to talk more about the annual meeting in just a minute. Safeguarding assets. So similar to, also expenditure of funds. Similar to allowability, the staff who are involved in spending funds need to understand the importance of safeguarding assets purchased with those funds, those non-consumable items that are going to last longer than a year. If people aren't familiar with the reason behind a requirement, like safeguarding an asset, tagging it as having been purchased with Title I funds, keeping some sort of inventory, or the timely spending of funds due to the expiration, if they're not familiar with those requirements, they may not understand why they're important. So sharing some of the background information and the why creates more of a partnership in which everyone is working towards the same goal as opposed to just checking these boxes off for some unknown reason. Next is your time and effort procedures. So individuals who are paid partly or in full with Title I funds, as well as their immediate supervisors who will be signing off on this documentation, need to know why they're completing it. Additionally, any staff working with payroll need to be familiar with who's being paid from Title I and what type of documentation needs to be maintained for those individuals. And you also need to make sure people are aware of proper documentation practices. So there's so many people who play a role in the implementation of the Title I program. Therefore, they may be involved in some level of documentation. Think about a phrase that appears on a lot of our monitoring checklist: detailed meeting minutes. So do your staff participating in meetings understand that detailed meeting minutes are going to include the date, the attendees, the topics of discussion, and a brief summary of those discussion topics? Are staff in your district aware of the type of documentation that needs to be saved, as well as where that documentation needs to be housed so that it can be located easily if needed? And then the last one I've got on here is just any other district-specific practices. So your district may have other written processes and procedures that are not specifically required by ESSA or Uniform Grant Guidance, but they still relate to Title I. So maybe there's a process for gathering and analyzing parent feedback on the school policy, or procedures to ensure that specific information is shared at the Title I annual meeting. Or maybe there's an aspect of Title I that you'd like to streamline through the creation of a process. Written processes and procedures outlining how a district actually does something are always an effective internal control and a really great piece of compliance documentation. So moving on to the Title I annual meeting. Section 1116C1 of ESSA requires that Title I schools convene an annual meeting. This should be at a convenient time to which all parents of participating children are invited to and encouraged to attend. And this meeting is to inform parents of several things. First is the school's participation under Title I. Next is the Title I program requirements, as well as the rights of parents to be involved in the program. So think about the information that your Title I schools are sharing during the annual meeting and how it's being shared. Are all of the schools sharing the same information? Is there a standard PowerPoint that they go over with them, maybe a handout that parents receive? Are these documents also available for parents who weren't able to attend the meeting? Are they maybe posted to the school's website? Or is there information that's been included in like a student handbook or something? Although there's no requirement that all schools utilize the same resource like a uniform PowerPoint during the meeting, it is important for you as the coordinator to ensure that all of your schools are sharing the correct information with parents. Let's also think about the term meeting. A meeting does imply that this is a gathering of people to share and discuss information. So simply providing parents with a handout about Title I would not constitute a meeting. However your annual meeting is structured, if it is one big session where they get information, or maybe there's a station set up at an event and parents have to go through all the stations, that's up to you. Be sure that there's an informed staff member there who's sharing information with parents and answering questions as needed. How are schools ensuring that as many parents or caregivers as possible are receiving this information? This is something you need to be discussing with your schools before the year starts. Is the event publicized through multiple methods? Maybe a flyer sent home and there's an email or a social media post, something like that. Has the annual meeting been paired with a highly attended event, like an open house or a back to school bash, something like that? And as I mentioned a minute ago, can parents unable to attend the meeting access the information at a later date? KDE does recommend that this meeting take place at the beginning of the school year, although ESSA doesn't specify a month or a deadline for having done this meeting. We think that having it at the beginning of the school year helps kind of establish those expectations and sets the tone for the rest of the school year. That means that the planning for this meeting should either have already been happening or be happening now. Next is our school family compact. This is from ESSA 1116D. So we know that this requires schools to develop that school family compact that's outlining the shared responsibilities for high student achievement, the teacher school responsibilities, parent responsibilities, and student responsibilities. Our March webinar included a deep dive into the school level parent and family engagement policy and the compact requirements. So I encourage you to go back and watch those linked on our Documents and Resources webpage, as well as sharing that with principals before the beginning of the 23-24 school year. We really looked at the content requirements during that, so I'm not going to go into them again here. Section D2A of 1116 requires that the compact be discussed as it relates to the individual child's achievement at least annually during a parent-teacher conference. This is only at the elementary level. The phrasing that's used in ESSA, which I kind of have bolded here, as it relates to the individual child's achievement, that indicates that just a general overview of the contents of the compact is not sufficient for demonstrating compliance. Instead, the discussion should detail how the responsibilities outlined in the compact can support any identified opportunities for improvement for the child. And similar to that annual meeting, KDE recommends that this occur during the first conference of the fall, again, to help set those expectations for the remainder of the year. However, ESSA does not specify a time when it needs to occur. When we think about documenting that compact discussion, and again, remember, this is only required for your Title I elementary schools. If a Title I middle or high school wanted to explore incorporating this as a best practice, they're welcome to do that. That would be great. It's just not required for them. So this slide has some examples of ways you might document that this discussion is taking place. These are just a couple that I thought of. If your district is doing something else that you think is effective, feel free to type that in the chat and share with us. So the guiding question that you need to be thinking about when it comes to this documentation: what is being provided to the teachers and or the parents to let them know how the compact will be discussed during the conference? First example, conference invitation. Could be a flyer, email message, social media post, that kind of thing. Quick reminder is that it is not a best practice to share information with parents through only one method. We've said this before, and we'll probably say it again. For example, not all parents and caregivers use social media. So a social media post about an event like Parent Conference Night is not going to reach all of your parents. So we really encourage you to send those invitations through more than one method. Another example documentation could be a reminder email to teachers, evidence of a training that teachers had surrounding the compact. Maybe it was discussed at a staff meeting. Some schools like to use kind of a conference agenda or just a list of talking points that the teacher can have on hand as a reminder. And then conference sign-in sheets. So when we think about, again, documenting this conversation, remember that the level of detail is key. If somebody looked at your documentation, would they know the context in which the compact was discussed? So this detail can make all the difference. Got some examples here for you. So not detailed would be an email reminder to teachers that just says, remember to discuss the compact. That doesn't tell them how to discuss it. Whereas remember to discuss the compact as it relates to the achievement of the individual child does tell them how to discuss it. This language just needs to clearly indicate how it will be discussed. So when we think about maybe our invitations and notifications to parents, we could say something like, discuss how the compact supports your child, or review the compact as it relates to your child's achievement. And if you're using a conference sign-in sheet as documentation, signatures alone are not going to be sufficient. A really easy thing you could do to a sign-in sheet would be to just add a column next to those signatures where the parents are going to check yes or no, we discussed the compact as it relates to my child. That would be some really good documentation. All right, do we have any questions? I'm going to check. I don't see any in the chat. If anybody wants to add something to the chat or raise their hand and come off mute, we can do that. And I'll check the email. I don't see any on the email. So our upcoming webinar dates, our next webinar is Thursday, August 31st at 10 a.m. Eastern. Be sure to mark your calendar for that. And I do like to remind you at the end of each webinar that we do value your feedback and we want to learn about what's helpful, what you want to see more of. So any comments, ideas, questions, if you'd like to submit those anonymously, you can do so through our optional webinar feedback survey. That is linked in our most recent Title I newsletter. You can also send any suggestions to your assigned consultant or to me. I'll do a last check for questions here before we sign off. And I don't see any, so I will thank you all for joining us this morning. Have a great day.